Montana Territory, January 25, 1888. Dr. Luther Whitmore pressed his thumb against the brass thermometer, squinting at the mercury line through cabin air that should have been freezing. 58 degrees Fahrenheit. He walked to the far corner away from the modest stove, where a few split pine logs crackled without urgency. 56 degrees. His medical bag sat near the door where frigid wind had followed him inside moments earlier, yet the floor beneath his boots radiated warmth, as if summer still lived beneath the planks. Outside, the Bitterroot Valley lay buried under 11 days of accumulated snow, the kind of winter that killed livestock in their pens and turned men's breath to ice before it left their mouths. 3 miles down the frozen creek, families huddled around roaring stoves in cabins that barely held 40 degrees despite burning through wood faster than they could split it. Here 2 children played on the floor in their shirt sleeves while their mother stirred a pot of stew, her face calm in a way Whitmore had not seen in any other home since the blizzard descended like divine judgment. He would spend the next hour trying to understand what this widow had built beneath her cabin, and the answer would humble every builder in western Montana. But that revelation belonged to a future moment. What mattered now in the arithmetic of survival and the currency of cordwood was a single impossible fact: Cordelia Thorne had defeated winter with half the fuel her neighbors consumed, and the secret lay buried where no one thought to look. 15 months earlier, Cordelia knew nothing about thermal mass or convection loops or the steady temperature of Earth below the frost line. She knew only that October carried the scent of approaching disaster, and she had 2 children who depended on her survival. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Philadelphia autumn had already turned bitter, the kind of cold that seeps through thin walls and thinner hope. Cordelia sat at the kitchen table in the boarding-house room. She could no longer afford watching Iris cough into a handkerchief while Theodore stacked wooden blocks with the focused intensity of a child who had learned not to complain about being hungry. The envelope bore a Montana postmark and the letterhead of Morrison and Associates Attorneys at Law. She broke the seal with fingers that had grown accustomed to trembling. Estate of Helena Thorne, deceased August 1885. Sole surviving heir. A cabin and 16 acres in Elk Creek, Bitterroot Valley. Conditions of inheritance: residence maintained through first winter season, property not sold or transferred for period of 2 years, failing which estate reverts to secondary claimant. Cordelia read it 3 times. Her grandmother Helena, a woman she had never met, whose name her mother spoke only in bitter fragments about abandonment and choices that decent women did not make. A cabin in Montana Territory, 2,000 miles from the Philadelphia boarding house where the landlady had begun leaving pointed notes about overdue rent. The letter included a bank draft for travel expenses and a key tied to a string that smelled of rust and time. Iris looked up from her handkerchief, her 6-year-old face too pale, too thin. The cough had not broken in 3 weeks, despite every remedy Cordelia could afford, which amounted to honey and prayer. Theodore, 4 years old and sharp-eyed, watched his mother with the careful attention of a child who had learned to read storms in adult faces. Winter in Philadelphia meant more cold rooms, more illness, more landladies with pointed notes. Winter in Montana meant the unknown, but the unknown came with a roof and land and the possibility that possibility itself still existed. She packed their belongings into 2 trunks and a carpet bag. The journey west took 11 days by rail, then another day by wagon from Stevensville to Elk Creek. The driver, a taciturn man named Hutchins, said little until they crested the final ridge and the valley opened below them like a promise or a threat. There it was. 16 feet square, rough-hewn logs with clay chinking a stone chimney leaning slightly west from years of prevailing wind. The fieldstone foundation raised the structure 8 inches off the frozen ground, and even from a distance Cordelia could see gaps in the roof boards where winter wind would find entry. Ordinary. Unremarkable. The kind of cabin that dotted the valley in anonymous clusters, each one a small declaration against the wilderness that wanted them gone. Hutchins helped unload the trunks, accepted his payment, and departed without ceremony. Cordelia stood in the October afternoon with her children and her inheritance, watching the wagon disappear down the valley road. Silence settled like a second skin. No street noise, no neighbors shouting through thin walls, no clatter of commerce, just wind through lodgepole pine and the distant sound of Elk Creek moving over stones. She opened the door with the rusted key. The interior smelled of abandonment and rodents and something else, something mineral and deep, that she could not name. A cast-iron stove squatted in the northwest corner, a table and 2 chairs, a rope bed frame without a mattress, shelves empty except for dust and mouse droppings. Iris immediately began coughing, the sound echoing off bare walls that offered no comfort. Cordelia knelt and pressed her palm against the plank floor. Cold. Not cool. Cold like touching stone and shadow, like the temperature had soaked into the wood and made a permanent home there. She stood and looked at the peaked ceiling where heat would rise and gather and leak away through gaps she could already see. The crawl space beneath the cabin would act like a wind tunnel, pulling frigid air across the underside of the floor, stealing warmth faster than any stove could generate it. Theodore, braver than he should have been, explored the corners while his mother tried to calculate survival in measurements of cordwood and degrees Fahrenheit. The arithmetic looked grim. She had teaching skills that no one in this valley needed, $47 remaining from the inheritance advance, and a winter approaching that cared nothing for her education or her circumstance. The first night she lit the stove with kindling and split pine she found stacked outside, probably cut by whoever maintained the property in Helena's final years. The cabin warmed to perhaps 50 degrees near the stove, dropping to 40 in the corners. Iris slept fitfully, coughing through dreams. Cordelia lay awake, listening to wind probe every gap in the walls, every loose shake on the roof, calculating how fast $47 would evaporate when converted to firewood and flour. Morning brought frost on the nail heads that protruded through the floorboards. She stoked the stove, fed her children the last of the bread from Stevensville, and tried to understand why Helena Thorne had lived here and what inheritance truly meant when stripped of sentiment. He arrived on the 3rd day. Cordelia was outside splitting kindling, a task she approached with more determination than skill, when the sound of hoofbeats pulled her attention to the road. A black gelding, well-bred and well-fed, carrying a man whose clothes spoke of money in a place where money was usually invisible. He dismounted with the ease of someone accustomed to being welcomed. Percival Drake. 52 years old, silver threading through dark hair, eyes that calculated value before acknowledging humanity. Owner of the Drake Consolidated Mining Operation 3 miles northwest. Employer of 40 men. Holder of mineral rights across 2,000 acres of Montana territory. He extended his hand and Cordelia shook it because refusing would have been noticed. His voice carried the practiced warmth of a man who had learned that friendliness sold better than force. Mrs. Thorne, Percival Drake, I wanted to welcome you to the valley and express my condolences about Helena. Cordelia waited. Men like Drake did not ride 3 miles for condolences. I'll come straight to the point. This property has mineral potential. Copper traces in the creek bed, possibly more beneath the surface. I'm prepared to offer you $12,000 for the land and structures. That's generous considering the cabin's condition. $12,000. More money than Cordelia had seen in her lifetime summed together. Enough to return east to rent a proper home, to pay doctors for Iris's cough, to purchase security against the grinding uncertainty that had characterized every day since her husband died. But the lawyer's letter had been explicit. 2 years, 1 winter. Conditions that suggested Helena had anticipated exactly this conversation. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Drake, but the terms of inheritance require me to maintain residence for 2 years before any sale or transfer. Something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation that happened too fast to read. His smile held steady. Of course, legal formalities. But perhaps you're unaware of what winter means here. This isn't Philadelphia cold. This is cold that kills. That cabin will burn through a cord of wood every 4 days just to stay above freezing. Your nearest neighbor is the Garrett place 2 miles east. If something happens, if the children get sick, if you run out of fuel, no one will reach you through snow that drifts 6 feet high. Iris coughed from inside the cabin, the sound carrying through gaps in the walls that proved his point more effectively than any argument. Drake's voice softened into what might have been genuine concern or excellent mimicry. I'm not trying to frighten you, Mrs. Thorne. I'm trying to help. $12,000 is more than this property is worth. It's enough to give your children a real future. Women in your position alone without resources, winter here is not your friend." Cordelia felt the weight of his gaze, the way it catalogued her worn dress and split knuckles, and the desperation that must have been visible despite every effort to hide it. She understood that he was right about the danger, right about her vulnerability, right about Winter's indifference to human need. But she also understood that men who rode 3 miles to offer generous prices usually knew something the seller did not. "I'll keep your offer in mind, Mr. Drake. Thank you for the welcome." He nodded slowly, his eyes moving past her to the cabin, to the chimney, to the foundation, as if trying to see through log and stone to whatever lay beneath. "The offer stands. When you change your mind, when winter shows you what it does to the unprepared, I'll still be willing to help. Good day, Mrs. Thorne." He mounted and rode north toward the mine, and Cordelia stood in October sunlight that would soon give way to something far less forgiving, wondering what Helena had known and what secrets justified 2 years in purgatory. That evening Theodore found the trap door. Not truly a trap door, just a loose plank that shifted when he jumped on it during a game that involved pretending the floor was hot lava. The board tilted up, revealing darkness beneath and the smell of disturbed earth. Cordelia knelt and pried the plank fully loose, then a second plank, then a third, until an opening emerged large enough to peer through. The crawl space beneath the cabin stretched away into shadow, 18 inches of clearance between cold ground and the floor joists. She lit a candle and lowered it through the opening. Bare dirt, dry and undisturbed except for a small area directly below where drag marks suggested something had been moved or buried. She squeezed through the opening, her dress catching on splinters, and crawled toward the disturbance. A box. Tin, roughly the size of a cigar case, wedged between 2 foundation stones in a position that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental loss. She pried it loose and carried it back to the light. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept moisture at bay for however long the box had waited, 3 items. First, a folded paper covered in technical drawings, cross-sections, and measurements and annotations in handwriting so precise it looked like printing. A schematic for something called an underground thermal storage chamber with arrows indicating airflow and labels marking stone placement, and depth measurements that descended 4.5 feet below the cabin floor. Second, a letter written on paper that had yellowed at the edges, addressed to Cordelia Marie Brennan in the same meticulous hand. She unfolded it carefully, conscious that Theodore and Iris were watching her with the intensity children reserve for moments when the adult world cracks open to reveal its machinery. The letter began without preamble. "Cordelia, if you are reading this, I have failed to finish what I started, and the responsibility passes to you. The cabin is cold because I never completed the thermal chamber. The plans are here. The principle is sound. Earth below the frost line maintains steady temperature. Stone stores, heat convection moves warmth where it is needed. Build it correctly, and you will survive winter on 1/3 the fuel your neighbors consume. Build it incorrectly, and the cabin will collapse. Follow the measurements exactly." The letter continued with warnings about Drake, about stolen patents and legal battles fought and lost, about a heating system designed for mines that had made Drake's father wealthy while Helena received nothing. It ended with coordinates: 5 feet deep southwest quadrant of the chamber. When you reach the correct depth, you will find what I could not use, but you might. The third item in the box was a small map, hand-drawn, marking the cabin's interior with an X positioned beneath where the stove now sat. Cordelia read the letter twice while her children waited in silence that felt like held breath. The fire in the stove burned low, and the temperature in the cabin dropped toward discomfort. Outside, October. Darkness gathered with the promise of November close behind, and November would bring the first serious cold, the kind that tested whether structures and humans could coexist without one killing the other. She had taught science in Philadelphia, had explained thermodynamics to girls whose families expected them to marry rather than understand why engines worked or heat transferred through metal. She knew the theory behind thermal mass, had read about root cellars that stayed cool in summer and relatively warm in winter because Earth itself acts as insulation and buffer against extremes. Helena's drawings made sense in a way that frightened her with their clarity. This was not speculation. This was engineering. But excavating beneath an occupied cabin, digging down 4.5 feet while maintaining structural integrity, lining a chamber with hundreds of pounds of stone, creating a convection system that would move heat without pumps or fans. All of this while feeding children and maintaining enough warmth to prevent illness. Attempting it alone, the magnitude felt designed to crush hope before the first shovel entered Earth. Theodore, who had been quiet through the discovery and the reading, spoke into the silence. "What does it say, Mama?" Cordelia looked at her son, at Iris beside him, at the cabin walls that would not hold heat, and the winter that would not hold mercy, at the choice between attempting the impossible and surrendering to Drake's $12,000, and the admission that Helena's inheritance was poisoned gift rather than salvation. "It says," she began, choosing words carefully, "that your great-grandmother was smarter than the men who tried to diminish her, and she left us instructions for staying warm." She did not mention the warnings, or the coordinates, or the suggestion that something valuable lay buried beneath the cabin floor. Children did not need the full weight of adult desperation, not yet. The next morning she walked 2 miles east to the Garrett place. Silas Garrett answered the door, a man of 47 with carpenter's hands and the skeptical expression of someone who had lived through enough Montana winters to recognize delusion when it appeared on his doorstep. His wife Anne hovered behind him with 3 children in view, and probably more elsewhere in the cabin that looked solid and well-built and engineered by someone who understood how structures survived. Cordelia asked about purchasing tools. A short-handled spade, a tin bucket timber for shoring if it became necessary. Silas asked what she planned to build, and she made the mistake of telling the truth about improving the foundation and creating thermal storage beneath the cabin floor. His laugh carried no malice, just the reflexive amusement of expertise confronting naivety. "Ma'am, I've built 20 cabins in this valley. Foundation work means raising the structure, not digging under it. You start excavating beneath a cabin that's already standing, you risk the whole thing collapsing on your head. And even if you don't kill yourself, undermining the foundation voids any structural integrity the place might have." Anne Garrett stepped forward, her voice gentler but no less certain. "There are easier ways to keep warm. Good chinking heavy curtains over the windows, banking earth around the foundation. Digging underneath is asking for trouble." Cordelia listened because dismissing advice from people who had survived what she had not yet faced would be arrogant and stupid. But she also remembered the letter, the precision of Helena's drawings, the suggestion that this woman had understood something the builders missed. "I appreciate the warning," she said. "I'll be careful." Silas sold her the tools at fair prices and threw in some advice about where to find fieldstone if she truly intended this folly. She carried the spade and bucket back to her cabin, aware that by evening the Garretts would mention the widow's strange plans to whoever they encountered, and by the next day the valley would have formed opinions about Cordelia Thorne's grip on reality. She found Octavia Marsh on the 3rd day of November. The old woman lived alone in a cabin 1 mile south, closer to the Stevensville Road. 71 years old, widowed for a decade, subsisting on a pension from a husband who had worked territorial administration before Montana achieved that dignity. Cordelia knocked because Helena's letter had mentioned one friend, one person who knew the truth about the stolen patents and the legal battles that consumed the last decades of her grandmother's life. Octavia opened the door and studied Cordelia with eyes that age had not dulled. "You have Helena's jawline. I wondered if you'd come or if you'd sell to Drake and run." He made an offer. "Of course he did. 12,015. Whatever the number, it's enough to make staying look foolish and leaving look wise." Octavia stepped aside. "Come in. We should talk about what you're actually inheriting." The interior was warmer than Cordelia's cabin testimony to good construction or better fuel supply, or both. Octavia poured tea from a pot that suggested she had been expecting company or simply maintained the rituals of civilization regardless of solitude. "Helena Thorne was the finest engineer I ever met." Octavia began, settling into a chair that had molded itself to her shape over years of use. She designed the heating system for Drake's mines back in 1861, back when it was Nathaniel Drake running the operation before Percival inherited his father's business and his father's sins. The system used underground thermal storage stone chambers that captured heat from the smelting operations and released it gradually, keeping the mine shafts above freezing even in deep winter. Revolutionary work. Helena should have made a fortune. Instead, Nathaniel filed the patents in his own name, claimed the design was his, paid Helena a pittance, and told her no court would believe a woman had engineered something that complex. Cordelia felt the tea growing cold in her hands. She sued for 20 years, spent every dollar she had on lawyers who took her money and lost her cases. Judges don't believe women engineer heating systems or invent anything more complicated than a better pie crust. By the time she died, she was destitute and half mad with the injustice of it, and Nathaniel Drake's son Percival had inherited a mining empire built partially on work he never acknowledged stealing. Why does Percival want the cabin? Octavia's smile carried the weight of knowledge hoarded against the precise moment when it would be needed. Because Helena told me 3 months before she died that she had hidden the proof. The original contract's letters from Nathaniel admitting the design was hers documentation that would destroy the Drake family's claim to several patents. She said the truth was built into the cabin itself, that anyone who completed what she started would find what she could not use. The coordinates: 5 feet deep southwest quadrant of the thermal chamber. Not buried randomly, but integrated into the construction, requiring the completion of Helena's design to access whatever evidence she had preserved. She never told you exactly where. She said the chamber itself would be proof enough, that anyone who could build it would understand what she understood, that the design would vindicate her, even if the legal documents never surfaced. But she also said— Octavia paused, refilling her tea with the deliberate care of someone buying time to choose words precisely that she hoped you would finish it, that you were the one person in her bloodline who might have inherited more than her name. Cordelia thought about Philadelphia classrooms, about teaching thermodynamics to girls who would never be allowed to practice engineering, about the peculiar loneliness of understanding how heat transfers through iron while the world insists such knowledge belongs to men. I've never built anything. Neither had Helena when she started, but she learned because the alternative was accepting that men who stole her work deserved to profit while she froze. Octavia's voice sharpened. Percival Drake knows something is hidden in that cabin. He's been trying to buy it since Helena died. The inheritance conditions kept him away until now, but he'll escalate. Men like him don't surrender what they think they own. Cordelia left with more questions than answers, but also with something that felt like permission or obligation, or both. That evening she pried up the first floorboards and lowered herself into the crawl space with a candle and a spade. The earth beneath the cabin was dry, hard-packed, undisturbed since the structure was raised. She marked out the chamber dimensions according to Helena's drawings, then began to dig. The work progressed in inches. Every morning before dawn she would wake, stoke the fire, feed the children, and then descend into the crawl space to excavate. 1 bucket of earth at a time, hauled up through the opening in the floor and carried to the woods behind the cabin, where scattered piles would not draw attention from anyone passing on the road. Theo helped by entertaining Iris by pretending the sounds of his mother's labor were part of some grand adventure rather than desperate calculation against approaching winter. By the end of the first week she had excavated a pit 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, 3 feet deep. Just enough space to sit upright, to work in a crouch, to feel the earth pressing close on all sides. The walls were raw dirt braced with scrap lumber to prevent collapse. She worked by candlelight and by feel, learning the difference between soil types, understanding where the earth would hold and where it wanted to crumble. Silas Garrett rode past one afternoon and saw her carrying dirt into the woods. He reined up, dismounted, approached with the cautious posture of someone preparing to witness something regrettable. "Mrs. Thorne, I heard you were actually doing it." Cordelia set down the bucket. Dirt stained her dress beyond any laundering, and her hands had developed calluses that would have scandalized her Philadelphia colleagues. The foundation needed attention. That's not foundation work, that's excavation. You're undermining the entire structure." He gestured at the cabin as if its impending collapse was visible to anyone with sense. "I've seen floors cave in from less. There was a cabin outside Missoula. Man tried to expand his root cellar without proper shoring. The whole place dropped 8 inches overnight. Family was lucky to get out alive. I'm being careful." "Careful doesn't matter when you're attempting something foolish." His voice carried frustration rather than cruelty, the exasperation of a professional watching an amateur ignore basic principles. "You've got children in there. What happens when winter comes hard and your floor collapses because you've been digging holes underneath it? Where will you go then?" Cordelia met his eyes, understanding that he was not wrong about the risk, but knowing that the alternative risks were equally fatal. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Garrett, but I'm going to finish what I started." He shook his head, the gesture of a man absolving himself of responsibility for someone else's disaster. "Your choice. But don't come asking for help when it all falls apart." He mounted and rode east, and Cordelia knew that by evening the valley would be discussing the widow who was too stubborn or too stupid to listen to sense. She returned to digging. Percival Drake's second visit came on November 18th. The temperature had dropped below freezing each night for a week, and the first real snow was perhaps 10 days away, according to the almanac Cordelia had purchased in Stevensville. She was hauling stones from Elk Creek Flat, pieces of granite and schist that she could carry individually when Drake appeared on horseback with 2 men she did not recognize. He dismounted without invitation, his eyes scanning the woodpile, the disturbed earth behind the cabin, the stack of stones near the door. His companions remained mounted, their presence suggesting enforcement rather than conversation. "Mrs. Thorne, I heard you've been making improvements. Repairs." Cordelia set down the stone she'd been carrying, aware of how she must look filthy and exhausted and small against 3 men whose combined authority could reshape her circumstance if they chose. "I also heard you're digging under the cabin, undermining the foundation. That's dangerous work, especially with children inside." His voice carried concern the way a knife carries sympathy while cutting. "There are building standards even out here. If the territorial assessor deemed the structure unsafe, he could condemn it, force you out for your own protection. The cabin is sound." "Is it?" Drake walked closer, his boots crunching on frost-brittle grass. "Because from where I stand it looks like you're attempting construction without training, without proper materials, without any understanding of what winter will do to a compromised structure. My offer still stands. $12,000. You and your children could be in a warm hotel in Butte by tomorrow evening, comfortable while you arrange travel back east or wherever you'd prefer to go." Cordelia forced her breathing to stay even, forced her voice to carry certainty she did not entirely feel. "The inheritance conditions are clear. I'm staying." Something flickered across Drake's face, calculation refining into decision. "Conditions can be challenged. If the cabin is unsafe, if you're putting children at risk through negligent construction, a judge might determine you've violated the spirit of Helena's will. I'd hate to see you lose everything because of stubbornness." He let that threat settle like snow accumulating into drifts. Then he smiled, and the smile was worse than the threat because it suggested patience, the confidence of someone who had won enough battles to know that losing this skirmish meant nothing against the certainty of ultimate victory. "Think about it, Mrs. Thorne. Winter is coming and you're not prepared. The offer expires when the first real snow falls. After that, you're on your own." He mounted and rode north with his silent companions, leaving Cordelia alone with stones and earth, and the understanding that Drake was not simply interested in the land. He was interested in ensuring she never completed what Helena started, never accessed whatever evidence lay hidden beneath the cabin floor. That night, she lit extra candles and studied Helena's drawings until the technical details burned themselves into memory. The chamber depth was critical 4.5 feet minimum to reach below the frost line, where earth temperature stabilized between 45 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The stone lining had to be 6 inches thick, creating thermal mass that would absorb heat during the day and release it gradually through the night. The convection system required precise placement. A duct from the stove allowing hot air to descend into the chamber, warming the stones, with a return vent allowing cooled air to flow back toward the heat source in a continuous loop. build it correctly, and survive winter on minimal fuel while accessing whatever Helena had hidden in the deepest layer of stone. Build it incorrectly, and watch the cabin collapse or the system fail, or Drake manufacture some legal mechanism to seize the property before truth could be excavated. Iris coughed herself awake around midnight, and Cordelia held her daughter while the fire burned low and the cabin temperature dropped toward 40 degrees despite the stove's best efforts. Heat rose, gathered uselessly at the peaked ceiling, leaked through gaps in the roof boards that she lacked time and materials to properly seal. Meanwhile, the crawl space beneath channeled cold air across the underside of the floor, creating a thermal drain that no amount of fuel could overcome. By morning, frost patterns decorated the nail heads protruding through the floorboards. Cordelia made porridge, fed her children, and descended into the earth with a spade and a determination that had moved beyond rational choice into the territory of necessity, stripped down to its essential form. She would dig because the alternative was surrender. She would line the chamber with stone because Helena's drawings promised this would work. She would build a convection system that defied common wisdom, because common wisdom had frozen her grandmother out of recognition and wealth and justice. And when she reached 5 feet deep in the southwest quadrant, she would find what Helena had hidden, or she would find nothing, but either way she would know that some battles were worth fighting, even when the odds suggested otherwise. Theodore appeared at the edge of the opening, his small face peering down into the excavation that now measured 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, 4 feet deep. "Mama, how much further?" Cordelia leaned against the earthen wall, feeling dampness seep through her dress, tasting dust and mineral and the particular staleness of air that had not moved freely in years. "Another 6 inches, sweetheart. Then we start placing the stones. And then we'll be warm." The question carried more weight than a 4-year-old should have to bear the understanding that warmth was not guaranteed, that survival required labor adults struggled to complete. Cordelia climbed out of the pit and pulled her son into an embrace that probably smelled of dirt and sweat and fear she hoped he was too young to identify. "Yes, then we'll be warm, I promise." Promises made to children should be kept, should be possible, should not require miracles disguised as engineering. But she spoke the words anyway because sometimes promises were all that stood between a family and the void that waited for those who admitted defeat. The first snow fell on November 23rd. Light flurries that melted by afternoon, but a warning nonetheless. Cordelia had reached 4.5 feet in the main chamber and had begun the careful work of placing stones against the earthen walls. Each piece had to be selected for size and shape, fitted tightly against its neighbors, without mortar creating a 6-inch barrier between earth and open space. The work demanded patience she did not have and precision that terror made difficult. Octavia visited on November 25th, bringing supplies and silence that felt more supportive than encouragement would have been. She lowered herself to peer into the excavation, studying the progress with eyes that had witnessed Helena's struggles and understood what this completion might mean. "She would be proud," Octavia said quietly, "and furious that it took this long and grateful that someone finally finished it, and probably critical of your stone placement technique." A smile softened the words. Helena was brilliant, but not particularly patient with those who worked more slowly than her mind moved. Did she ever complete a chamber, even one? In the mines, yes. Several all functioning exactly as designed. But never here, never for herself. She ran out of time or money or belief that fighting mattered. I never knew which. Octavia straightened with the care of someone whose spine had learned to protest sudden movements. "Drake came to see me yesterday, asked questions about what Helena might have left behind, what she might have told me before she died. He's frightened, Cordelia. Men like him don't make threats unless they're afraid of what truth might cost them." "What did you tell him?" "That Helena died bitter and poor, and if she'd had evidence worth using, she would have used it." Octavia's smile carried the satisfaction of a woman who had survived enough years to know when lying served justice. "I didn't mention you or the cabin or the fact that we've been talking. Let him wonder. Wondering makes men careless." She left, and Cordelia returned to placing stones with hands that had blistered and healed and blistered again, building a chamber that would either save her family or stand as monument to ambition that exceeded competence. By December 1st, the thermal chamber was complete. 4.5 feet deep, 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, walls lined with carefully fitted granite and schist, creating a stone battery capable of absorbing and storing heat. The floor was bare earth covered with 4 inches of sand for drainage, preventing moisture from seeping upward into the cabin. Cordelia had cut a 4-inch square opening through the floorboards near the stove, positioning a crude duct fashioned from scrap tin to angle down into the chamber. A second opening on the opposite end allowed passive ventilation, creating the convection loop that would move warm air into the chamber and draw cooled air back toward the stove. The access hatch sat flush with the floor, hidden beneath a wool rug and positioned under the rope bed frame. From above, with the floorboards replaced and the furniture repositioned, the cabin looked exactly as it had before, ordinary and unremarkable and entirely unchanged. But beneath, the architecture had transformed into something Helena had envisioned, and Cordelia had built a system that worked with earth and stone and the invisible movement of heated air to create survival where conventional wisdom said only suffering awaited. She lit the stove and monitored the temperature through the first full day of operation. The heat descended through the tin duct into the chamber, warming the stone walls, gradually storing energy that would radiate upward through the floorboards for hours after the fire died. By evening, the floor that had been cold enough to frost now radiated gentle warmth. By the second day, the cabin held 54 degrees with a fire that consumed half the wood her neighbors would need. Iris stopped coughing. Theodore played on the floor in bare feet, something that would have been impossible the previous week. Cordelia sat at the table with Helena's letter and understood that sometimes inheritance meant more than property, that sometimes grandmothers left instructions for survival that doubled as vindication for lives spent fighting battles the world refused to acknowledge. The southwest quadrant, 5 feet deep. Whatever Helena had hidden waited there, built into the deepest layer of stone, where only someone who completed the chamber would find it. Cordelia moved the rug, opened. The hatch descended into the chamber with a candle and a small pry bar. The stone lining extended below the chamber floor by 6 additional inches, insurance against groundwater or shifting earth. She counted stones from the southwest corner, working systematically, testing each one for looseness or irregularity. The 47th stone shifted when she applied pressure. She worked it free carefully, mindful that disturbing the structure could compromise the thermal properties she had spent weeks creating. Behind the stone, a cavity. Inside the cavity, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, a small lead box. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside, documents. A contract dated March 15, 1861, between Helena Thorne and Nathaniel Drake, establishing a partnership for the development of geothermal heating systems for mining operations, with Helena named as principal designer and equal profit participant. A series of letters from Nathaniel to Helena discussing technical specifications, acknowledging her innovations, promising fair compensation. And finally, a letter dated November 1867. Nathaniel to Helena never sent the paper suggesting it had been retrieved from trash or stolen from a desk, the words damning in their casual cruelty, "I have filed the patents in my name alone. No court will support your claim. Women do not engineer heating systems. Accept the settlement I offered or accept nothing. Either way, the work is mine now." Evidence. Complete, documented, sufficient to destroy the Drake family's claim to patents that had generated wealth for 2 generations. Hidden where only someone who believed Helena's engineering could work would ever find it, preserved against the day when her heir might finish what she started and use what she could not. Cordelia sat in the stone-lined chamber with proof of injustice in her hands and winter gathering strength above ground, and understood that she now owned something far more valuable and dangerous than 16 acres of Montana territory. She owned the truth, and truth had a way of making powerful men desperate. She sealed the documents back in the lead box, replaced the stone carefully, and climbed back into the cabin where her children slept soundly on a floor that had finally learned to hold warmth. Outside, December wind tested the walls and found them sufficient. The stove burned with modest flames, and the chamber beneath stored heat like a promise kept across generations. Tomorrow Drake would learn that she had completed something he thought impossible. Eventually, he would understand what that completion implied. And when that understanding arrived, Cordelia would face a choice between using the truth and surviving the consequences of its revelation. But tonight, her children slept warm, and the cabin held heat the way Helena had promised it would, and sometimes survival began with small victories before the larger battles commenced. She banked the fire and lay down beside Iris and Theodore, feeling the warmth rising through the floorboards, evidence that engineering could defeat winter when applied correctly. Tomorrow she would split more wood. Tomorrow she would monitor the system and adjust airflow and continue the careful dance between generating heat and storing it. Tomorrow Drake might arrive with new threats or new offers or new strategies. But tonight, in a cabin that finally understood its purpose, Cordelia allowed herself to believe that finishing what Helena started had been possible all along, that the inheritance she had claimed was not just land and structure, but the stubborn certainty that some truths were worth the fight required to prove them. The thermal chamber hummed with stored warmth beneath her, and winter waited outside with the patience of something that had time to test every weakness, and Cordelia Thorne slept with the knowledge that Phase 1 was complete and the real war was just beginning. December brought testing that mattered more than theory. The thermal chamber performed exactly as Helena's drawings promised, storing heat through daylight hours and releasing it gradually through darkness that stretched longer each week. Cordelia tracked temperatures in a small notebook, recording measurements at dawn, noon, dusk, midnight. The pattern held consistent 54 degrees near the walls, 57 near the stove, never dropping below 52, even when the fire burned down to coals and outside temperatures plunged toward zero. Her woodpile diminished at 1/3 the rate Silas Garrett's did. She knew this because Theo counted stacks during walks to Elk Creek for water, comparing their reserves to the massive cords Silas maintained to keep his larger family warm. 3 armloads every 4 hours instead of 6. Half a cord every 5 days instead of 1 cord every 3. The mathematics of survival transformed from desperate calculation to manageable routine. But success created visibility, and visibility attracted attention she would have preferred to avoid. Smoke from her chimney rose thin and intermittent, barely visible against winter sky, while neighboring cabins belched constant plumes that marked struggle as clearly as flags mark surrender. People noticed. Questions traveled faster than answers in valleys where isolation made gossip essential currency. Octavia visited on December 10th, her arrival preceded by the crunch of snow under boots and the labored breathing of a woman whose age made winter travel increasingly difficult. She accepted tea and sat near the stove with the relief of someone who had walked further than advisable. Silas Garrett is telling people your chimney barely smokes. Says either you're freezing to death, too proud to admit it, or you've done something he can't explain. Octavia's fingers wrapped around the cup, absorbing warmth. He's not the only one noticing. Let them notice. Cordelia poured her own tea, feeling the floor's warmth through her shoes, evidence that required no defense. Drake is noticing too. He rode to town yesterday, spent an hour with the territorial assessor, asked questions about building codes, safety inspections, what constitutes grounds for property condemnation. Octavia's voice carried the flat certainty of someone reporting facts already verified. He's building a legal framework to remove you if persuasion fails. Outside, Iris and Theo played in snow that had accumulated to knee height for adults, waist height for children. Their laughter filtered through walls that held heat better than they had any right to, and Cordelia understood that Drake's interest had shifted from acquisition to elimination. He did not need the cabin. He needed the evidence buried beneath it to stay buried, needed Helena's vindication to remain theoretical rather than documented. How long before he moves from questions to action? Octavia set down her cup with the deliberate care that preceded difficult truth. Assessor is scheduled to inspect in early January. Drake suggested concerns about structural integrity, improper excavation, danger to children. If the assessor determines the cabin is unsafe, you'll have 48 hours to vacate before territorial marshal enforces the order. And if I refuse, then you lose the inheritance, the children are removed for their own protection, and Drake purchases the property at assessment value, which will be zero if it's condemned." Octavia's expression hardened into something that resembled Helena's determination as captured in the single daguerreotype Cordelia had found among her grandmother's possessions. "He's not trying to buy you out anymore. He's trying to bury you." December 15th brought Marcus Webb, the territorial assessor, a man whose jurisdiction extended across 3 counties and whose expertise supposedly qualified him to determine whether structures met minimum safety standards. He arrived without warning, accompanied by Drake and a man Cordelia did not recognize, who carried surveying equipment and an official demeanor. She met them at the door, blocking entry with her body in a way that probably looked defensive because it was. Webb consulted papers on a clipboard, his breath forming clouds in air that felt warmer near the cabin than it should have been. "Mrs. Thorne, I'm here to conduct a safety inspection. We've received reports of unauthorized excavation beneath an occupied dwelling, structural modifications performed without proper oversight, potential hazards to minors residing on the premises." Drake stood slightly behind Webb, his face arranged into concern that fooled no one who bothered to look past the surface. The third man, the surveyor, began setting up a transit as if measuring angles and elevations would reveal secrets the structure chose to hide. Cordelia kept her voice level, her stance firm. "The cabin is sound. The foundation is secure. My children are safe and warm." "That's for me to determine, ma'am. I'll need to inspect the interior, the foundation, any modifications you've made." Webb shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the role but committed to performing it. "You can cooperate voluntarily, or I can return with a marshal's order. Either way, inspection happens." Letting them inside meant revealing the chamber, showing them proof that Helena's design worked, giving Drake visual confirmation that whatever he feared had been completed. Refusing inspection meant legal consequences that would achieve the same result through different mechanisms. Cordelia stepped aside because some battles were lost by fighting them. Webb entered first, his eyes scanning the single room that contained table, stove, bed, 2 children who watched strangers invade their space with the wariness children learn when adults bring trouble. The temperature registered immediately. Webb unbuttoned his coat, frowned, pulled a thermometer from his case and hung it on a nail. 56 degrees. He walked to the far corner away from the stove. 54 degrees. "How are you heating this space?" "Stove." Cordelia gestured at the cast-iron box where a modest fire burned without urgency. "That stove shouldn't produce this temperature. Not in December. Not with gaps in the roof boards I can see from here." Webb crouched, pressing his palm against the floorboards. His frown deepened into confusion that looked genuine. "The floor is warm." Drake moved closer, his attention fixing on the floor with intensity that confirmed what Cordelia had suspected. He knew. Not specifics, but the general shape of what Helena had built, what Cordelia had completed, what warmth rising through planks implied about engineering beneath. "Where's the excavation?" Drake's question came too fast, too sharp, abandoning the pretense of concern for naked curiosity. "Show us what you dug under here." Webb shot Drake a look that suggested overstepping, but the assessor's authority could not overcome the momentum Drake had created. Cordelia calculated options and found none that preserved secrecy. She moved the bed, lifted the wool rug, revealed the trapdoor that sat flush with the floor like a secret finally exhausted from hiding. The chamber below drew their attention like gravity draws falling objects. Webb descended first, his bulk barely fitting through the opening, his candle illuminating stone walls and sand floor, and the elegant simplicity of a design that worked because physics did not care about skepticism. He emerged 5 minutes later, his expression transformed from suspicion to something approaching wonder. "It's a thermal battery, underground heat storage. I've read about similar systems in European mines, but never seen one implemented in residential construction." He turned to Cordelia with questions reforming into respect. "Who engineered this?" "My grandmother, Helena Thorne. The plans were in the cabin when I arrived." Drake's face had gone carefully blank, the expression of a gambler who had just seen his opponent reveal a winning hand. He did not descend into the chamber, did not need to see what Webb's reaction had already confirmed. Instead, he stepped toward the trap door with movements too deliberate, too controlled, as if suppressing impulses that wanted expression. This excavation compromised the foundation. Removing that much earth beneath a load-bearing structure creates settlement risk potential collapse. Drake spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being believed. The children are in danger every moment they remain in this cabin. Webb studied the floor joists visible through the opening, examining the shoring that Cordelia had installed according to Helena's specifications, the way weight distributed across reinforced beams rather than compromised earth. His assessment took 3 minutes of silence, broken only by the stove's quiet crackling. The foundation is properly shored. The load is adequately supported. I see no evidence of settlement or structural failure. Webb straightened, making notes on his clipboard with the careful precision of someone aware their words created legal records. The thermal chamber is unconventional but engineered correctly. The cabin meets safety standards. Drake's control slipped enough to show fury beneath. She's a widow with no construction experience who dug a hole under her house. That can't possibly meet standards. The work is competent. The results speak for themselves. Webb gestured at the warm interior, at the children playing safely, at evidence that contradicted the narrative Drake had attempted to construct. I'm filing a report stating the dwelling is safe for occupancy. No grounds for condemnation. He left, taking his equipment and his official conclusions with him. The surveyor followed without having measured anything useful. Drake remained standing in the center of Cordelia's cabin with his pretense of concern abandoned like clothing that no longer fit. His voice dropped low enough that Iris and Theo would not hear clearly adult conversation happening in the frequencies children learn to ignore. You found something down there, something Helena hid. Cordelia met his eyes, refusing to grant him the satisfaction of confirmation or denial. I found warmth, exactly what she promised. Warmth, of course. Drake's smile carried no humor, just the bitter acknowledgement of a truth he could not quite grasp, but knew existed. You'll fail eventually. Winter here is longer than you understand, colder than you've experienced. That system might work for a month, 2 months, but it will fail. The stones will crack from thermal stress, or moisture will infiltrate, or you'll miscalculate the fuel requirements. And when it fails, when you're desperate and freezing, my offer will still be available. He left without waiting for response, and Cordelia locked the door behind him with hands that shook from adrenaline rather than fear. She had won the inspection, but lost whatever illusion existed that Drake would simply surrender and move on. Men who built empires on stolen work did not accept defeat gracefully. The remainder of December passed in careful monitoring and small adjustments. Cordelia learned to read the chamber's mood through subtle indicators, the warmth of specific stones, indicating heat distribution, the sound of air moving through vents suggesting convection patterns, the stable temperature that meant thermal mass was performing exactly as designed. Iris's cough disappeared, entirely absent for the first time since they left Philadelphia. Theo grew 1/2 inch and complained about being hungry with the vigor of a child whose body felt safe enough to grow. Christmas came without celebration beyond extra portions at dinner, and a story Cordelia invented about thermal chambers in distant kingdoms where queens outsmarted dragons through engineering rather than swords. New Year arrived with snow accumulation measuring 3 feet in the valley, 5 feet in the drifts that formed against north-facing walls. January 1888 opened with temperatures that tested whether survival was possible or simply provisional. The mercury dropped to 10 degrees, then 5, then 0, settling into a pattern that suggested winter had decided to demonstrate what it could achieve when genuinely motivated. Cordelia burned through wood at a rate that would have been catastrophic without the chamber's efficiency. But the cabin held steady at 53 degrees, while reports from Octavia indicated neighbors struggling to maintain 40. Silas Garrett stopped by on January 8th, his arrival motivated by curiosity that had finally overcome skepticism. He stood in the cabin's warmth, feeling the floor radiate heat, examining the trap door Cordelia opened to show him what he had dismissed as folly. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the peculiar discomfort of a man whose expertise had proven incomplete. I was wrong. This shouldn't work, but it does. That chamber is storing heat like I don't know what. Cast iron holds heat, but not like this. Not all night. Stone has high thermal mass. It absorbs slowly, releases slowly. The earth provides insulation. The convection loop moves heat where it's needed. Cordelia recited the principles that had become as familiar as prayer, the thermodynamics that meant the difference between survival and surrender. My grandmother understood what others missed. Why didn't she tell anyone? Why keep this secret if it works? She tried. Men took her ideas and claimed them as their own. Cordelia did not mention Drake specifically, did not need to when context made the accusation clear. Eventually, she stopped trying to convince people and focused on preserving the knowledge for someone who might actually use it. Silas crouched at the edge of the trap door, his carpenter's eyes tracing the stonework, the airflow patterns, the elegant efficiency of a system that worked with nature rather than fighting it. I've built 20 cabins and every one of them fights winter, burns through wood like the fuel is endless, barely keeps people alive. This makes winter manageable. He left an hour later, but something had shifted in his departure. Not quite apologetic, but thoughtful in a way that suggested questions were reforming into different shapes. Cordelia marked it as progress, incremental change in a valley that valued tradition over innovation until innovation proved itself too thoroughly to ignore. The storm arrived on January 10th. Not gradually, not with warning that allowed preparation, but as a wall of Arctic air that dropped temperatures 20 degrees in 6 hours and kept falling. By evening, the thermometer outside Cordelia's cabin registered 12 degrees. By midnight, 0. By dawn on January 11th, -8, and the wind had begun. It came from the north, pulled straight down from Canada by pressure systems that meteorologists would later study, and pioneers would simply try to survive. 40 miles per hour, sustained gusting to 60, carrying snow horizontally with force that turned individual flakes into stinging projectiles. Drifts, formed in minutes, reshaped themselves constantly, buried landmarks and erased trails, and transformed the familiar valley into alien terrain where navigation became guesswork and survival became hourly negotiation. The cabin shuddered under the assault. Wind found every gap in the logs, every loose shake on the roof, every point where human construction met natural fury with insufficient defense. Cordelia stuffed cloth into the worst gaps, hung blankets over windows, created barriers against the cold that wanted inside with the persistence of water seeking cracks. The thermal chamber performed as if winter's escalation meant nothing to physics. Heat descended through the tin duct spread across stone walls that had been storing energy for 6 weeks, radiated upward through floorboards that transformed from cold enemies to warm allies. The stove burned steadily, not desperately. 3 armloads of wood every 4 hours instead of 6. The interior temperature held at 54 degrees, while outside the world attempted to demonstrate what -20 felt like, with wind chill factored into equations that measured suffering. Night fell early on January 11th, though the storm made daylight largely theoretical. Cordelia fed Iris and Theo, banked the fire, listened to wind that sounded like wolves howling in harmony. She did not know that across the valley families were burning furniture to supplement failing wood supplies, that hypothermia was setting in among children whose parents could not generate heat fast enough that the next 11 days would test whether Montana territory was habitable by humans or merely visited by them on borrowed time. January 12th brought -15 degrees. January 13th brought the blizzard proper, snow falling so thick that visibility dropped to arm's length, accumulation measured in feet rather than inches. Cordelia ventured outside only to reach the woodpile, a journey of 10 yards that required rope tied from door to shed to prevent disorientation in white void that erased all reference points. Octavia's cabin 1 mile south fell to 38 degrees despite her best efforts. She burned wet wood when dry supplies failed, filled her small space with smoke that made breathing a choice between suffocation and freezing. Silas Garrett's household, larger and better built, held 40 degrees by running the stove continuously and sleeping in shifts to maintain the fire. His children wore every piece of clothing they owned to bed, layered against cold that made sleep difficult and waking worse. Cordelia's cabin maintained 53 degrees. Iris and Theo slept in light blankets, their breathing easy, their bodies relaxed in warmth that had become so reliable they no longer remarked on it. The chamber beneath stored heat like a promise, kept releasing it, gradually transforming winter from enemy to inconvenience. On January 15th, the 7th day of the blizzard, Percival Drake made his decision. The storm provided cover. Visibility was zero. Anyone moving through the white chaos would be invisible until they appeared on your doorstep. The territorial marshal was snowed in at Stevensville, unable to respond to emergencies that required travel beyond town limits. Legal consequences felt distant when survival itself demanded illegal action. He came alone on foot, following the frozen creek that connected his mine to the valley settlements. The journey that should have taken 30 minutes stretched to 2 hours of fighting through drifts and wind that wanted to erase him. By the time he reached Cordelia's cabin, his face bore the early signs of frostbite. His hands were numb inside gloves that proved inadequate, and desperation had transformed from motivation into absolute necessity. He pounded on the door with fists that barely felt the impact. "Mrs. Thorne, open up." Cordelia heard the voice through wind and wall, recognized it despite distortion, understood immediately that nothing good arrived at her door in a blizzard. She moved Iris and Theo to the far corner away from the entrance before approaching. "What do you want?" "I need shelter. I got turned around in the storm. Let me in before I freeze." Every instinct screamed against opening the door to a man who had threatened her family, who wanted the evidence she possessed, who represented the exact power that had destroyed Helena. But leaving someone to freeze in a blizzard violated principles that ran deeper than self-preservation, contradicted the moral framework she had taught in Philadelphia classrooms and tried to model for her children. She opened the door. Drake stumbled inside, bringing cold and snow and the sharp scent of desperation. He collapsed near the stove, his back against the wall, his breathing labored from exertion and exposure. Cordelia closed the door against wind that wanted to follow him, that seemed angry at being denied entry. For several minutes, the only sound was Drake's gradual recovery, the rasp of air entering lungs that had worked too hard in conditions too brutal. He pulled off his gloves, revealing fingers that were white at the tips, damaged by cold that had penetrated inadequate protection. Cordelia brought water, not because she wanted to help, but because watching frostbite progress towards serious injury required action even when the victim was an enemy. He drank, cradling the cup in damaged hands, feeling warmth that must have seemed miraculous given the contrast between interior and the storm outside. His eyes moved around the cabin, cataloging details, the children safe and warm, the modest fire that should not have been sufficient, the floor that radiated heat in defiance of every principle he thought he understood. How? The question emerged rough, barely more than whisper. How is it this warm in here? Engineering, the kind Helena mastered and your father stole. Cordelia sat at the table, maintaining distance, her body positioned between Drake and her children in a configuration that was protective formation disguised as casual arrangement. You wanted to know what she hid. Now you know. She hid the truth about who could actually engineer solutions to problems men claimed only they could solve. Drake's laugh was bitter, damaged. The thermal chamber. I should have known she'd actually built one. Father said she was brilliant, said her designs were years ahead of anyone else in the territory, said claiming her work was the smartest thing he ever did. He flexed his damaged fingers, watching them move with the detachment of someone cataloging injury. And here you are, proving she was right all along. More than right. I found the evidence. The contracts, the letters, everything that proves your father's fraud and your inheritance of stolen work. Cordelia kept her voice level, refusing to let anger override strategic advantage. I could destroy your family's reputation, reclaim patents worth thousands, maybe tens of thousands of dollars. Everything you own that came from the mining heating systems, it's all built on theft. Drake was silent for a long moment, his breathing steadying, his color returning as warmth penetrated cold that had come close to killing him. When he spoke, his voice carried neither denial nor defense, just the flat acknowledgement of someone too exhausted to maintain pretense. "What do you want money? I'll match whatever the patents are worth, pay you to stay silent. You can keep the cabin, keep everything, just never file those claims. I want you to leave and never come back. Stop the threats. Stop the legal maneuvering. Stop pretending you have any right to this property or this truth." Cordelia stood, moving to the stove to add wood that the system did not quite need, but the gesture emphasized her control of the space, her ownership of heat, while he remained dependent on her mercy. "When the storm breaks, when you can travel safely, you go back to your mine and your stolen legacy, and you pray I never decide that justice matters more than peace." Outside, wind reached a crescendo that made the cabin walls groan, that found new gaps to exploit, that reminded everyone inside that nature remained the ultimate authority, regardless of human conflict. Drake pulled his coat tighter, despite the relative warmth, still suffering from exposure that would take hours to fully reverse. He started to stand, to make some move toward departure, despite the suicidal impossibility of traveling in the current conditions. Cordelia blocked his path, not with her body, but with words sharp enough to stop motion. "You're not leaving tonight. Storm's too brutal, you'll die 50 yards from the door, and I'm not having that on my conscience." Her voice carried disgust that he'd put her in this position, forced her to choose between principles and revenge. "You can stay until morning, until visibility improves enough for you to see your way back. But you touch anything in this cabin, you threaten my children. You even look at that trap door too long and I'll throw you back into the storm myself." Drake sank back against the wall, defeated by circumstance and temperature, and the terrible irony of being saved by the very system he'd tried to prevent. Iris and Theo watched from their corner with the wide-eyed awareness of children witnessing adult conflict they could not fully understand but knew mattered enormously. The night crawled forward, measured in stove feeding and wind surges, and the peculiar tension of enemies sharing space designed for family. Drake dozed fitfully near the heat source. Cordelia stayed awake, unwilling to trust that desperation would not override self-preservation if opportunity presented itself. The chamber beneath continued its silent work, storing and releasing heat according to physics that cared nothing for the drama above proving Helena's genius through function rather than argument. Around 3 in the morning, Drake made his mistake. He thought Cordelia had fallen asleep, thought the children were too young to understand or too frightened to act. He moved quietly toward the trapdoor, his intention obvious even without words. Perhaps he planned to destroy the chamber, to damage the convection system, to eliminate the physical proof that Helena's design worked. Perhaps he simply wanted to verify that the evidence existed where Cordelia claimed. Either way, he lifted the edge of the wool rug with hands that had recovered enough function to grasp. The rug snagged on something, a board that had warped slightly or a nail that protruded just enough. Drake pulled harder, his attention focused on the trapdoor mechanism rather than his surroundings. The rug came free suddenly, his momentum carrying him backward. He stumbled off balance, his boot coming down hard on the floorboard directly above the primary vent from the chamber. The crack was audible even over the wind. The board split along its grain, the damage spreading to the adjacent plank that contained the tin duct connection. The duct bent its angle, shifting from 45 degrees to nearly horizontal, disrupting the airflow pattern that made the entire system function. Hot air that should have descended into the chamber now spilled uselessly into the crawl space, never reaching the stone thermal mass that needed it. Cordelia was across the room before Drake could recover his balance, her fury finally finding expression in physical intervention. She shoved him away from the damage with strength that surprise made effective, sending him sprawling toward the stove. "Get out, now. Storm or no storm, get out of my house." Drake scrambled to his feet, seeing in her face something that convinced him exile into the blizzard was preferable to remaining. He grabbed his coat. His gloves pulled the door open against wind that had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. The storm swallowed him in seconds, his figure disappearing into white void that offered neither forgiveness nor direction. Cordelia slammed the door. Locked, it turned to assess the damage. The broken floorboard could be replaced, but the bent duct represented immediate crisis. She could already feel the temperature dropping, the chamber's heat storage capacity meaningless if warm air never reached the stones to replenish what they released. Without the convection loop functioning, the cabin would revert to conventional heating, burning wood at 3 times the current rate, a rate she could not sustain through the remaining days of the blizzard. She had perhaps 2 hours before the temperature dropped below 50 degrees. 4 hours before it fell below 45. By morning, without repair, the thermal advantage that had kept her children safe would evaporate, replaced by the same desperate fuel consumption that plagued every other cabin in the valley. The repair required descending into the chamber in the middle of the night during a blizzard, working by candlelight in cramped space, straightening a duct without tools designed for the purpose, all while maintaining enough fire in the stove to prevent immediate freezing, but not so much that she wasted fuel she could not replace. She lowered herself through the trapdoor, feeling warmth still radiating from stones that had hours of stored energy remaining. The bent duct was accessible if she worked from an awkward angle. Her body twisted to fit the space, her hands reaching up to manipulate metal that resisted straightening. The work demanded patience and force in equal measure, careful pressure that would restore function without causing additional damage. 20 minutes into the repair, boot steps crunched through snow outside. Heavy, deliberate, someone approaching the cabin with purpose. Cordelia froze, listening, calculating whether Drake had found courage or compass enough to return. The knock, when it came, carried a different rhythm, heavier, more solid. Silas Garrett's voice penetrated the walls with the force of someone accustomed to making himself heard over distance. "Mrs. Thorne, it's Silas. I saw Drake heading back toward the mine, walking like a man who'd lost something. You all right in there?" Cordelia climbed from the chamber, unlatched the door. Silas stood in swirling snow, his face protected by a scarf that left only his eyes visible, his bulk suggesting he'd dressed in layers sufficient to make the journey from his cabin 2 miles away through conditions that made travel suicidal. "What are you doing out in this?" "Couldn't sleep. Storm like this, I worry about folks who might need help. Saw light moving in your windows different than usual, thought something might be wrong." He stepped inside, his attention immediately fixing on the broken floorboard, the displaced rug, the open trapdoor revealing the chamber beneath. "What happened?" Cordelia explained in sentences that minimized emotion and maximized fact. Drake's arrival, his attempted sabotage, the damaged duct that threatened everything the thermal system accomplished. Silas listened without interrupting his expression, moving from surprise to anger to the practical assessment of a man whose skills were suddenly relevant. "Show me the damage." They descended together into the chamber, Silas's bulk barely fitting through the opening designed for Helena's smaller frame. He examined the bent duct with the methodical attention of someone who understood that quick fixes usually created slower failures. His diagnosis came quickly. "The metal's soft enough I can straighten it, but we need to secure the mounting or it'll shift again with thermal expansion. You got spare tin scraps from the original construction?" "A few pieces, enough for bracing." They worked together in the cramped space, Silas providing the strength to bend metal back to proper angle, while Cordelia fabricated supports that would prevent future displacement. The task required an hour of awkward collaboration. Bodies positioned to maximize leverage in space that barely accommodated one person, let alone 2. But carpenter skills combined with desperate necessity produced results that engineering textbooks could not improve. When they climbed back into the cabin, the duct was straight, properly secured, already resuming its function of channeling warm air into the thermal mass that made survival possible. Silas examined the broken floorboard, produced tools from pockets that seemed designed to carry solutions, and made temporary repairs that would hold until proper replacement became possible. He worked in silence until the immediate crisis was resolved, then sat at the table accepting water with the weariness of someone who had traveled too far in conditions too dangerous for reasons he probably couldn't fully articulate. His voice when he spoke carried something new, something that had not existed in previous conversations. "I owe you an apology. When you started digging, when you talked about thermal chambers and underground heat storage, I thought you'd lost your mind. Figured grief and desperation had pushed you past reason." He gestured at the chamber, at the warm cabin, at the evidence that competence had nothing to do with who conventional wisdom granted authority. "I was wrong. Not just wrong about the system working, wrong about who gets to understand how heat moves through stone and earth and air. Your grandmother knew things I never learned in 20 years of building, and you had the sense to listen. The apology mattered less than the shift it represented, the crack in certainty that made future learning possible. Cordelia accepted it with a nod that acknowledged without absolving recognition that being right did not erase the cost of being doubted. Drake will be back. Maybe not during this storm, but eventually. Men like him don't forget what threatens them. Silas pulled his scarf back into position, preparing for the return journey through conditions that had not improved. When he comes, when he tries again, you send word. I'll testify to what I saw tonight, what he tried to do. A man who sabotages a widow's heating during a blizzard that's not someone the valley will support once they know the facts. He left dissolving back into the storm with the competence of someone who knew winter's moods and respected them enough to survive. Cordelia locked the door, checked the duct one final time, confirmed that temperature was recovering toward normal. The chamber hummed with restored function stone, releasing stored warmth, while fresh heat descended to replenish reserves, physics performing its reliable magic regardless of human interference. Iris stirred from sleep, her small voice carrying across the cabin. "Mama, is everything okay?" The question deserved truth, but could not bear full weight of what truth entailed. Cordelia moved to the bed where her children had slept through crisis that could have killed them, where warmth rising through floorboards created safety that wealth could not purchase and power could not revoke. "Everything's okay, sweetheart. The cabin is warm. We're safe. Go back to sleep." Simple words that contained complexity beyond their syllables. Safe for tonight. Safe because Helena had engineered solutions and Cordelia had built them, and Silas had witnessed and helped. Safe because systems that worked according to physics were harder to destroy than systems dependent on human goodwill. The blizzard continued for 5 more days. Temperature held at -18, sometimes dropping to -25, when wind chill transformed measurement into approximation of suffering. Cordelia burned through her woodpile at the calculated rate 3 armloads every 4 hours, trusting that the mathematics she had verified through December would continue through January's escalation. Reports filtered through when the storm finally broke on January 24th, news traveling through a valley that was counting casualties and measuring damage. 3 homesteaders dead from hypothermia, having run out of fuel and frozen in cabins that could not hold heat against wind that found every weakness. 2 children lost to pneumonia, their immune systems compromised by cold that turned illness into fatality. Livestock casualties exceeded, counting entire herds frozen in pens where shelter proved theoretical. And Cordelia's cabin, small and ordinary and occupied by a widow everyone had dismissed as foolish, had maintained 53 degrees through weather that killed experienced frontiersmen. The smoke from her chimney had been so minimal that several neighbors had assumed she'd abandoned the property, fled to town, or died quietly, where no one would discover the bodies until spring thaw. Dr. Luther Whitmore's arrival on January 25th began the revelation that would transform assumption into evidence and evidence into change. But that belonged to the future that Part 3 would document. What mattered in the present, in the aftermath of the blizzard that tested whether humans belonged in Montana or merely visited on nature's temporary sufferance, was the simple fact that physics had proven more reliable than opinion, that engineering defeated winter when applied correctly, and that sometimes the radical act was simply finishing what others started and refused to acknowledge. Cordelia sat at her table with a cup of coffee made from beans Octavia had brought before the storm. Feeling warmth rise through floorboards that had learned their purpose, watching her children play on a floor that no longer fought against their survival. Somewhere north, Drake was dealing with his own damage, his own failures, his own recognition that destroying the chamber had proven impossible, because the chamber was not a thing to be destroyed, but a principle to be understood. And beneath it all, literally beneath the cabin floor in a stone-lined chamber that stored summer's memory through winter's assault, Helena's vindication waited not as document, but as demonstration proof that could not be argued because it functioned too completely to deny. The worst was over. The blizzard had passed. But the real storm, the confrontation that would force the valley to choose between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truth, was just beginning to gather strength. Dr. Luther Whitmore made his rounds through the Bitterroot Valley like a man documenting disaster. The blizzard had retreated, leaving behind temperatures that held at -18 and a landscape transformed into white desolation that made navigation feel like guesswork, verified by landmarks barely visible through glare and distance. He carried his medical bag and a notebook where he recorded temperatures, symptoms, casualties, the arithmetic of a winter that had killed with efficiency, born from 11 days of unrelenting assault. The garret cabin registered 38 degrees when he arrived, though Silas had the stove running hot enough that the cast iron glowed dull red at the edges. Ann Garrett met him at the door with 2 of her children showing signs of mild hypothermia, despite never leaving the interior, their lips carrying a bluish tint that suggested the threshold between survival and medical emergency had been crossed and recrossed throughout the storm. Whitmore examined them with the clinical detachment that allowed him to deliver treatment without drowning in the magnitude of suffering his profession forced him to witness. Silas pulled him aside while Anne prepared willow bark tea for the children, speaking in low tones, meant to avoid alarming his family further. "We burned 2.5 cords, maybe more. Lost count around day 7 when we started breaking up furniture to supplement the woodpile. Kept the fire going every hour, day and night, and still couldn't get the temperature above 40 most days." Whitmore made notes, numbers that would later inform territorial reports about habitability and winter survival rates, data that suggested Montana's climate was testing whether human settlement was sustainable or merely temporary delusion. "How much wood do you have remaining?" "Enough for another week if we're careful. After that we start pulling down outbuildings for fuel." Silas rubbed his face with hands that bore burns from tending a stove that demanded constant attention. "It's not sustainable, Doc. We can't keep burning through resources like this every winter and expect to have anything left come spring." The pattern repeated at every cabin Whitmore visited. Eugene Cross had burned through furniture and 3 cords, his interior barely holding 34 degrees, despite efforts that left him with frostbitten fingers and exhaustion that bordered on collapse. Octavia Marsh had survived at 36 degrees by burning wet wood that filled her small space with smoke, damaging her lungs in exchange for warmth that proved barely adequate. The calculations were brutal, massive fuel consumption yielding temperatures that kept people alive, but not comfortable survival measured in degrees above freezing rather than anything approaching warmth. Then Whitmore rode to Cordelia Thorne's cabin expecting the worst, because widows and children always suffered disproportionately during disasters, because competence in engineering did not guarantee access to fuel, because sometimes survival was luck rather than skill. The smoke from her chimney was minimal, a thin ribbon that suggested either she had run out of wood days ago or something else entirely. Whitmore approached with the professional dread of someone who had found too many bodies during winter rounds, who understood that silence often preceded discovery of frozen families who simply ran out of options. Cordelia answered his knock immediately, her appearance neat despite weeks of isolation, her face showing fatigue, but not the desperate exhaustion that characterized other survivors. Behind her, Iris sat at the table reading while Theodore played with wooden blocks on the floor. Both children in regular clothing, rather than the layered defensive arrangements that marked every other household. Whitmore stepped inside, and the warmth hit him like physical presence. Not the aggressive heat of a stove burning desperately, but steady, comfortable warmth that felt impossible given everything he had witnessed in the previous 24 hours. He pulled out his thermometer with movements that had become automatic, hung it on a nail near the door, waited the required 3 minutes for mercury to settle into accuracy. 58 degrees Fahrenheit. He walked to the far corner away from the modest stove, where a small fire burned without urgency. 56 degrees. He crouched and pressed his palm against the floorboards, feeling warmth radiating upward, as if summer had been stored beneath the planks and was being released in defiance of January's authority. His medical training had not prepared him for this specific confusion, the cognitive dissonance between expectation and measurement, between what winter should have done and what this cabin had prevented. "Mrs. Thorne, how is this possible?" Cordelia's smile carried the satisfaction of someone who had completed impossible work and survived to witness its validation. "Would you like to see?" She moved the bed, lifted the rug, opened the trapdoor that revealed the thermal chamber beneath. Whitmore descended into the stone-lined space with the careful attention of someone encountering engineering that contradicted his understanding of how cabins worked. The stone still radiated heat-warming air that rose through the opening in a gentle current that explained everything and justified the revolution it implied. He emerged 10 minutes later, his notebook filling with sketches and measurements and observations that would later inform his testimony at the territorial courthouse, evidence that physics could be documented and replicated regardless of who understood it first. "How much wood did you consume during the blizzard?" "Half a cord, maybe slightly less." The mathematics assembled themselves without conscious effort. Silas Garrett, 2.5 cords for 38 degrees. Cordelia Thorne, half a cord for 58 degrees. 20 degrees warmer on 1/5 the fuel. The efficiency was not incremental improvement, but paradigm shift proof that conventional cabin design was fighting winter rather than working with earth and stone and convection to make winter manageable. "Your grandmother designed this 25 years ago for the Drake mines. They claimed her work filed patents in their name paid her nothing." Cordelia spoke with the measured calm of someone presenting facts that had been verified too thoroughly to require emotional amplification. "She died trying to prove the theft in courts that wouldn't believe a woman could engineer heating systems this sophisticated." Whitmore's expression shifted from scientific interest to something harder recognition that the marvel beneath this cabin represented not just technical achievement, but injustice spanning decades. Percival Drake built his family's fortune partially on stolen work. His father did. Percival inherited the theft and has been trying to prevent proof from surfacing ever since. The implications were assembling themselves into narrative that explained Drake's interest in the property, his attempts to buy or condemn the cabin, his escalation from persuasion to legal threats. Whitmore made additional notes, understanding that his role was expanding beyond medical documentation into territory that would require testimony about more than just temperature measurements. Silas Garrett arrived while Whitmore was still recording observations, his arrival announced by bootsteps crunching through snow that had been compacted by wind into surface hard enough to support weight. He entered without knocking, his face carrying urgency that suggested news rather than emergency. "Doc, good you're here. Saves me writing to find you." He glanced at Cordelia, his expression conveying something between apology and determination. "I need to tell someone official what I saw during the storm, what Drake tried to do." The story emerged in sentences stripped of embellishment, Carpenter's precision applied to description of events that had unfolded in this cabin while the blizzard provided cover for sabotage. Drake's arrival, his presence through the night, his attempt to damage the thermal chamber system by destroying the convection duct. The repair that Silas himself had helped complete, his testimony as witness to deliberate destruction of property during life-threatening weather. Whitmore listened with the trained attention of someone who understood that stories told to doctors often became evidence in contexts beyond medical treatment. "You're willing to testify to this formally under oath if necessary." Drake sabotaged her heating during a blizzard. If that duct hadn't been repaired, if the system had failed, Mrs. Thorne and her children might have frozen. Silas spoke with the flat certainty of someone who had calculated those consequences and found them intolerable. A man who'd do that, he deserves whatever legal consequences follow. By evening, the revelation had begun spreading through the valley with the speed that news travels when it confirms suspicions and upends assumptions simultaneously. Octavia visited her arrival, bringing both support and additional documentation letters Helena had entrusted to her before death correspondence that filled gaps in the timeline of theft and legal battles that had consumed decades. Cordelia made her decision that night, sitting at the table while her children slept on the floor that had learned to radiate warmth. The lead box from the southwest quadrant of the chamber sat before her, containing contracts and letters and evidence that could destroy the Drake family's reputation and reclaim wealth built on stolen genius. Keeping the documents hidden meant safety, avoiding confrontation with a man whose resources and connections gave him advantages in any legal battle. But Helena had not hidden the evidence to keep it safe from use. She had preserved it for the exact moment when someone with nothing to lose and everything to prove could wield truth as the weapon it deserved to be. Some battles were worth fighting, not because victory was certain, but because surrender meant accepting that power always defeated principle, that theft was acceptable when dressed in respectability, that women who understood heat and stone and convection should stay silent while men claimed credit. February brought the confrontation that made choice into action. Cordelia filed formal charges against Percival Drake, with the territorial marshal presenting evidence that included contracts proving Helena's authorship of the mining heating system letters from Nathaniel Drake, acknowledging her design work, and testimony from Silas Garrett regarding attempted sabotage during the blizzard. The charges were theft of intellectual property fraud regarding patent claims and destruction of property with intent to cause harm. Drake responded with lawyers from Helena who specialized in making accusations disappear, men whose fees exceeded what most Montana homesteaders earned in 5 years. They filed counter-motions claiming the evidence was fabricated, that Helena had been compensated fairly for minor contributions to designs primarily created by Nathaniel Drake, that Cordelia was attempting extortion by leveraging historical grievances into undeserved settlement. The territorial court in Stevensville scheduled hearings for late March, when travel became possible and witnesses could reach the courthouse without risking death by exposure. The intervening weeks transformed into preparation that consumed every moment not dedicated to basic survival. Cordelia worked with Octavia to organize documentation chronologically building timeline that showed pattern of theft extending across multiple inventions. Silas provided testimony about the thermal chamber's construction and performance, his professional assessment that the system required engineering knowledge beyond what amateurs could improvise. And the Valley watched because legal battles between widows and mining magnates were entertainment when they were not instruction about whose truth courts were designed to validate. The hearing began on March 22, 1888, in a courthouse that smelled of wood smoke and tobacco and the particular mustiness of legal spaces where justice was performed as ritual regardless of whether it was achieved as outcome. Judge Nathaniel Cartwright presided, a man in his 60s whose reputation suggested fairness, tempered by skepticism toward claims that sounded too convenient to be true. Drake's lawyers opened with character assassination disguised as context. They painted Helena as bitter eccentric who had claimed credit for others' work, delusional woman whose mental state deteriorated in her final years to the point where her accusations could not be trusted. They suggested Cordelia had manufactured evidence to support inheritance claim, that the documents were forgeries created to extort settlement from family whose only crime was hiring Helena for minor technical assistance decades earlier. Cordelia sat at the plaintiff's table listening to her grandmother transformed into cautionary tale about women who overestimated their contributions, about widows who grasped at wealth they had not earned, about the fundamental unreliability of female testimony regarding technical matters. The lawyers were skilled, their arguments constructed to sound reasonable while containing assumptions that made justice impossible. Then it was Cordelia's turn. She stood and approached the bench with documents organized in chronological sequence. Each piece labeled and cross-referenced the work of someone whose teaching career had required presenting complex information to audiences predisposed toward dismissal. She began with the partnership contract from 1861, walking Judge Cartwright through language that explicitly named Helena as principal designer with equal profit participation. Your Honor, this contract was signed by both parties and notarized by territorial authorities. It establishes that Helena Thorne was not providing minor technical assistance, but was the primary engineer designing the thermal storage system for Drake Consolidated mining operations. She moved to the technical correspondence letters between Helena and Nathaniel discussing design specifications, heat transfer calculations, stone placement requirements. The letters were in Helena's handwriting, demonstrating knowledge that could not have been acquired through casual observation, but required deep understanding of thermodynamics and structural engineering. These letters show that Mrs. Helena Thorne possessed expertise in thermal dynamics, material science, and practical engineering applications. The specificity of her technical descriptions contradicts the defense's characterization of her as someone making minor contributions to others' designs. Drake's lead attorney, a man named Harrison Montgomery, whose silver hair and confident bearing suggested decades of winning cases through force of presentation, rose with objection that carried practiced indignation. "Your Honor, correspondence proves nothing about who actually created the designs." Thorne could have been copying from Nathaniel Drake's work, transcribing his ideas while adding minor suggestions. Cordelia did not raise her voice, did not allow emotion to override the precision she had learned teaching girls who faced similar dismissal of their intellectual capacity. "Then perhaps Mr. Montgomery can explain this letter dated November 1867, written by Nathaniel Drake to my grandmother, but apparently never sent. It was found in his desk papers after his death, and came into Helena's possession through means I cannot verify, but whose authenticity can be established through handwriting analysis." She handed the document to Judge Cartwright, watching his expression shift as he read Nathaniel's admission of theft, the casual cruelty of a man who knew courts would not support a woman's claim against his word, regardless of evidence. The judge read it twice, his silence stretching long enough that the courtroom tension became palpable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone recognizing that the case had shifted beneath assumptions he had brought to the bench. "This letter, if authentic, constitutes admission of fraudulent patent filing. I'll need independent verification of the handwriting comparison with known samples of Nathaniel Drake's correspondence." "I've brought exemplars, Your Honor." Business letters from Nathaniel Drake, held by the Territorial Land Office, signed contracts from his mining operations, personal correspondence donated to the Montana Historical Society. The handwriting analysis can be conducted by qualified experts. The hearing recessed for 3 days while handwriting specialists examined the evidence. Cordelia spent those days in Stevensville boarding house monitoring expenses that depleted her limited resources, while Drake's lawyers stayed in the hotel and ate at restaurants that charged more for single meals than she budgeted for a week. The inequality was not subtle demonstration that wealth provided endurance in legal battles, even when it could not guarantee victory. The analysis confirmed what Cordelia already knew. The letter was genuine. Nathaniel Drake's handwriting verified across multiple samples, his admission of fraud standing as evidence that could not be explained away through legal maneuvering. When the hearing reconvened, Drake's defense had shifted from denial to mitigation arguments, that even if Nathaniel had improperly claimed credit, the work had been completed decades ago, patents had expired, compensating Helena's estate would be punitive rather than restorative. Dr. Luther Whitmore's testimony changed the equation from historical grievance to contemporary relevance. He presented his measurements from the blizzard, the temperature comparisons between Cordelia's cabin and neighboring structures, the fuel consumption calculations that proved the thermal chamber's efficiency. His medical credentials lent weight to technical testimony that might otherwise have been dismissed as lay observation. The system misses. Cordelia Thorne, constructed based on Helena Thorne's designs, achieved 20 degrees higher interior temperature using 1/5 the fuel consumed by conventionally designed cabins. This is not incremental improvement. This represents fundamental understanding of thermal dynamics that continues to be relevant and valuable. He continued with description of the attempted sabotage, Drake's effort to destroy the convection system during the blizzard, the potential fatal consequences if repairs had not been successful. His voice carried professional detachment that made the accusations more damning than emotional testimony would have achieved. Mr. Percival Drake attempted to disable a heating system that was keeping 2 children alive during weather that killed 3 adults in this valley. The motivation for such action suggests awareness that the thermal chamber's success validated Helena Thorne's claims about her engineering expertise, claims that threatened the Drake family's reputation and potentially their patent holdings. Silas Garrett testified next, his carpenter's authority lending credibility to technical descriptions of the chamber's construction and performance. He acknowledged his initial skepticism, his warnings about undermining foundations, his eventual recognition that Helena's design was engineered correctly, despite violating conventional wisdom about cabin construction. "I've built cabins in Montana for 20 years. I thought I understood how to fight winter. What Mrs. Cordelia Thorne built showed me I'd been fighting wrong, burning resources to achieve results that better engineering could accomplish with fraction of the effort. Then came the testimony that transformed the case from individual grievance into pattern of institutional theft. 6 families stood to testify, each presenting evidence that Nathaniel Drake had appropriated designs and inventions from individuals who lacked resources to fight back legally. A rancher whose water pump design had been patented by Drake Consolidated. A blacksmith whose improved ore smelting process had been claimed by Drake's metallurgist. A widow whose late husband's innovations in timber processing had been filed under Drake Company names months after he died. The pattern was consistent: identify useful innovation created by someone without legal sophistication or financial resources. Offer minimal compensation or simple theft. File patents under Drake Company ownership. Defend through lawyers who overwhelmed individual plaintiffs with procedural complexity and endless delays. The cumulative weight of testimony painted portrait of systematic appropriation spanning 30 years business model built on identifying others' genius and claiming it through superior access to legal mechanisms designed to protect property while remaining agnostic about whose property deserved protection. Judge Cartwright took 2 weeks to deliver his ruling. Time he spent reviewing precedents and consulting with territorial legal advisors about implications that extended beyond single case into questions about how patent law functioned when power imbalances made theft routine and justice exceptional. His written decision, delivered on April 12, 1888, was 37 pages of legal reasoning that built from established principles to conclusions that restructured the Drake family's entire patent portfolio. The core findings were unambiguous. Helena Thorne had been the principal designer of the thermal storage system used in Drake mining operations. Nathaniel Drake had fraudulently claimed her work. Percival Drake had benefited from and actively perpetuated that fraud through attempts to suppress evidence of the original theft. The remedy was equally clear. All patents related to the thermal storage system were reassigned to Helena Thorne's estate, with Cordelia as executor and primary beneficiary. Drake Consolidated was ordered to pay compensatory damages representing 25 years of royalties that should have been paid to Helena, calculated at market rates for patent licensing in mining applications. The amount was $73,000, a sum so large that gasps rippled through the courtroom when it was announced. More money than most people in Montana Territory would see in lifetimes, wealth that transformed Cordelia from struggling widow into woman with resources that created possibilities previously belonging only to imagination. But the judge was not finished. His ruling included findings regarding the attempted sabotage during the blizzard, civil damages for destruction of property and endangerment of children, punitive damages designed to deter future similar conduct, an additional $12,000, bringing the total judgment to $85,000. Percival Drake sat motionless as the ruling was read, his face carrying the blank expression of someone watching his world restructure itself into configurations he had not anticipated and could not control. His lawyers immediately filed notice of appeal, procedural reflex that would delay payment while higher courts reviewed the decision, but everyone in the courtroom understood that the appeals would fail because the evidence was too strong and the pattern too clear, and the public sentiment too aligned against systematic theft to allow technical legal maneuvering to overturn justice that had been too long delayed. Drake's mining operation began liquidation proceedings within a month, assets sold to pay judgments that exceeded his ability to maintain solvency. The family name, once synonymous with mining success in western Montana, became cautionary tale about building empires on foundations of stolen work. Percival Drake himself left the territory by summer, relocating to California, where his past might be less immediately recognizable and his future less constrained by reputation destroyed in Stevensville courthouse. The $73,000 arrived in incremental payments as Drake's assets were converted to cash and distributed according to court order. Cordelia deposited the funds in the Stevensville Territorial Bank, watching numbers that had been abstract become concrete wealth that created responsibility as much as it provided opportunity. She understood that Helena had not endured decades of legal battles and died bitter so that her granddaughter could simply be comfortable. The money represented vindication that demanded continuation, justice that required transformation into legacy rather than termination in personal benefit. By June 1888, the Helena Thorne School of Applied Science occupied a building that had previously served as general store before the owner retired and the property sat vacant. Cordelia purchased it for $8,000, invested another $12,000 in renovations that created classroom space, laboratory area, living quarters for students who traveled from distant homesteads. The curriculum focused on practical science, thermodynamics, structural engineering, water systems, agricultural chemistry, the disciplines that determined whether families survived or failed in territory that forgave no ignorance about how physical world actually functioned. The school accepted students regardless of gender, charging no tuition for those who could not afford it, requiring only commitment to learn and willingness to share knowledge once acquired. The first class included 15 students, 7 girls, 8 boys ranging in age from 12 to 17, drawn from families who understood that education in practical science was investment rather than luxury. Iris, at 10 years old, served as assistant instructor for younger students, teaching basic thermodynamics, using the thermal chamber beneath their cabin as laboratory demonstration. Theodore helped maintain the building and grounds, his 8-year-old energy channeled into tasks that made him feel essential to enterprise larger than himself. Octavia moved into quarters adjacent to the school, her role officially listed as librarian but functionally extending to keeper of institutional memory, storyteller who ensured students understood that the knowledge they acquired had been preserved by women who fought battles that should not have been necessary, but were fought anyway because surrender meant accepting that some people deserved to understand how the world worked, while others deserved only to suffer from that ignorance. The publication of The Thorne Thermal System, A Practical Guide, consumed the autumn of 1888. Cordelia wrote the technical manual with the precision she had developed teaching complex subjects to audiences who would be tested not by examinations, but by survival. The guide included complete specifications for building thermal chambers, calculations for determining appropriate depth based on local frost lines, stone selection criteria, convection system design, troubleshooting procedures for common problems. She priced it at $2, enough to cover printing costs while remaining accessible to homesteaders whose resources measured in tens rather than hundreds of dollars. The first print run of 500 copies sold out in 3 months. Demand, driven by word spreading through valleys where winter had demonstrated the difference between systems that fought nature and systems that worked with Earth's thermal properties to make cold manageable. Silas Garrett built the first replication that spring, his chamber constructed according to Thorne's specifications beneath an expansion to his existing cabin. The performance matched Cordelia's results. 20-degree temperature improvement, 70% reduction in fuel consumption, interior comfort, that made winter transition from enemy to be defeated into season to be accommodated. By winter 1889, 43 cabins within 80 miles of Elk Creek had incorporated thermal chambers into their construction or retrofit them into existing structures. The technique spread organically, each successful implementation becoming demonstration that convinced skeptics, each family that survived winter comfortably on reduced fuel becoming advocates for engineering over tradition. The changes were not merely technical. The valley's social dynamics shifted as expertise became visible in ways that contradicted assumptions about who could understand thermodynamics and structural engineering. Women who built thermal chambers found themselves consulted on construction projects, their knowledge valued in contexts that had previously granted authority exclusively to men. Children who learned the principles at Helena Thorne School returned to their families carrying understanding that made them contributors to survival rather than simply dependents who consumed resources. Some patterns resisted transformation. Skeptics remained homesteaders who preferred familiar methods, even when familiar meant inefficient people who viewed change as threat regardless of evidence that change worked. But the mathematics were too stark to ignore indefinitely, the fuel savings too significant to dismiss as anomaly, the comfort too tangible to attribute to luck rather than design. Winter 1889 to 1890 brought testing that confirmed what the previous year had suggested. The thermal chambers performed reliably across varied conditions, maintaining interior temperatures between 52 and 58 degrees, while consuming fuel at rates that allowed families to preserve wood piles for other purposes, to invest labor in productive work rather than desperate fuel gathering, to experience winter as season rather than continuous emergency. Cordelia expanded this cabin during summer 1890, adding a second room that served as classroom space when school was in session and living quarters when students returned to their homesteads. The addition was constructed according to Thorne specifications, thermal chamber beneath providing heat that made the enlarged structure as comfortable as the original had been. The transformation was visible in details that accumulated into different reality. Iris, now 14, taught thermodynamics to students older than herself, her authority derived from knowledge rather than age. Theodore, 12 and growing into height, that suggested he would exceed his father's build, helped Silas construct chambers for families too elderly or infirm to complete the work independently. Octavia, approaching her 75th year, maintained correspondence with engineers and educators across the territory, networking that positioned the Helena Thorne School as institution whose influence extended beyond the Bitterroot Valley. The Legacy Fund, established with $20,000 from the court settlement, provided scholarships for students pursuing technical education at territorial universities, with preference given to women and individuals from families without financial resources. The first recipients, 2 girls who had completed the Thorne School curriculum and demonstrated aptitude for engineering, departed for Montana State College in autumn 1890, their tuition paid through fund that Helena had never known would exist, but had made possible through decades of refusing to accept that theft should be permanent. By 1891, the Thorne thermal chamber had become standard feature in cold climate construction across western Montana and northern Idaho, referenced in territorial building guidelines as recommended practice for residential heating efficiency. Engineers who analyzed the system confirmed what Helena had understood 3 decades earlier. Earth below the frost line maintains stable temperature. Year-round stone provides thermal mass that stores and releases heat. Gradually, convection moves air according to temperature differentials that require no mechanical assistance. The principles were ancient, older than civilization, observable anywhere humans paid attention to how caves stay cool in summer and relatively warm in winter, how stone walls radiate heat long after fires die. Helena's innovation had not been discovering the physics, but applying them systematically to solve specific problem engineering solution that worked because it aligned with natural processes rather than fighting them. Cordelia stood in the expanded cabin on a December morning in 1891, watching snow fall outside windows that overlooked the valley where she had arrived 5 years earlier with 2 sick children and $47 in inheritance that had seemed more curse than gift. The thermal chamber beneath her feet hummed with stored warmth, performing its reliable magic of making winter manageable through understanding that had been preserved across generations, knowledge that had survived theft and legal battles, and the assumption that women who understood heat and stone should remain silent while men claimed credit. Iris was at the school teaching a class on water systems and freeze protection, her 14-year-old voice carrying authority that came from competence rather than permission. Theodore was helping Silas install a chamber beneath the new church building community space that would remain comfortable during services without requiring fuel expenditure that strained the congregation's limited resources. On the wall above Cordelia's table hung a framed daguerreotype of Helena Thorne, the only image that had survived her death, showing a woman in her 50s with eyes that suggested intelligence unsoftened by the world's insistence that such intelligence belonged elsewhere. Below the photograph, a brass plate bore inscription that Cordelia had commissioned from the Stevensville metalworker Helena Thorne, 1820 to 1885. Engineer, inventor, justice delayed but not denied. The door opened, admitting cold air, and Octavia's aged figure, her movements slower each year, but her mind sharp as the winter air she brought inside. She carried letters correspondence from across the territory and beyond, requests for technical guidance on chamber construction, inquiries about scholarship availability, invitations for Cordelia to speak at engineering conferences where her grandmother's work was finally being recognized not as curiosity, but as contribution. You've received another offer. University in Chicago wants you to demonstrate the thermal system at their engineering symposium next spring. travel expenses paid honorarium of $200. Octavia set the letter on the table with others that had arrived in recent weeks, evidence that validation was expanding beyond Montana territory into national recognition. They're calling it the Thorne method now. Textbooks are citing Helena's principles in chapters on passive heating and thermal mass applications. Cordelia read the invitation, feeling the weight of opportunity that came with vindication, the responsibility that accompanied recognition. She thought about the girls currently studying at the school, learning that understanding thermodynamics was not remarkable but simply true, that engineering belonged to anyone willing to learn its principles and apply them carefully. She thought about Theodore helping Silas, absorbing knowledge through practice that would make him builder who understood heat as well as wood and stone. She thought about Helena, dying bitter and unrecognized, preserving evidence and knowledge for granddaughter she would never meet, faith that eventually truth would matter more than power. Outside, winter continued its work of testing whether structures and systems were adequate, whether humans had learned enough about working with cold rather than simply fighting it. The thermal chamber answered with steady warmth, evidence that some battles were won not through force, but through understanding that sometimes the radical act was simply paying attention to what worked and sharing that knowledge freely, rather than hoarding it for profit or letting it die with its creator. Iris arrived home as dusk transformed snow into blue shadows, her face flushed from cold and excitement about lesson that had gone well. Students who had grasped concepts about heat transfer and convection that would keep them alive during winters to come. Theodore followed minutes later, covered in stone dust and satisfaction about work, completed another family's cabin now equipped with system that would transform their winter from endurance test into manageable season. They gathered around the table for evening meal, 4 people in a cabin that had learned to hold warmth, their conversation ranging across technical problems and student progress and plans for spring expansion. Octavia told stories about Helena preserving memory for children who had never known their great-grandmother, but inherited her legacy anyway, knowledge that flowed through generations not as possession but as responsibility. After dinner, after Iris and Theodore had gone to bed in the alcove that stayed warm through physics rather than fuel expenditure, Cordelia sat alone with the documents that had transformed her life from desperate flight to purposeful building. The contracts, the letters, the evidence that had been hidden in stone and preserved for exactly the moment when it could serve justice rather than simply document injustice. She thought about the question Iris had asked months earlier, whether she regretted refusing Drake's $50,000 offer, whether the struggle and danger and confrontation had been worth the outcome. The answer had seemed obvious, then seemed more obvious now with years of perspective and evidence of impact that extended beyond personal benefit into systemic change. Some things mattered more than money, more than comfort, more than the safety that came from avoiding conflict with powerful men who wanted truth to stay buried. Truth itself mattered. Justice mattered even when delayed across generations. Knowledge mattered especially when shared freely with those who had been told they could not understand it. Legacy mattered not as inheritance of wealth but as transmission of capability, the passing forward of understanding that made survival possible and suffering optional. The thermal chamber beneath her feet continued its work, storing summer's memory through winter's assault, proving every day that Helena Thorne had been right about heat and stone and the Earth's capacity to moderate extremes when humans built systems that worked with natural processes rather than fighting them. Outside Montana, winter held the valley in darkness, and cold that would have killed her family 5 years earlier would still kill families who lacked knowledge or resources or simply bad fortune. But inside, warmth rose through floorboards that had learned their purpose, and the future that Helena had preserved without knowing whether it would ever arrive had become present that justified the faith required to believe that truth eventually mattered, that engineering could defeat injustice when applied with the same precision it brought to defeating winter. Cordelia banked the fire for the night, knowing it would burn low but not die, trusting the thermal mass beneath to release stored heat through darkness that stretched toward dawn. She climbed into bed beside her sleeping children, feeling the warmth that rose from chamber that held summer's gift through winter's demand, and understood that some inheritances came not as property, but as principles, not as wealth, but as wisdom, not as endings, but as beginnings that stretched forward into futures that their creators would never see, but made possible anyway through the stubborn certainty that some truths were worth preserving even when the world insisted they did not matter. The cabin held its warmth through the night. The valley held its cold. And between them the thermal chamber mediated with the patient efficiency of physics that cared nothing for human drama, but worked reliably for anyone who understood its principles and built correctly. Winter would return. It always did. But it would find different valley now, one where survival was engineering rather than luck, where knowledge flowed through families and schools rather than dying with its creators, where women who understood heat and stone were recognized not as anomalies, but as people who had paid attention to what worked and shared it, because that was what people did when they valued survival over profit and justice over comfortable lies. Helena Thorne's legacy was not the money, though the money had enabled transformation. It was not even the thermal chamber, though the chambers had saved lives and would save more. The legacy was the principle that understanding belonged to everyone willing to learn that theft could be reversed when evidence was preserved and courage was summoned, that sometimes finishing what others started was the most important work a person could do. And that legacy, unlike the thermal mass that eventually released its stored heat and needed replenishing, would continue forward through generations, who built on what they inherited, rather than simply consuming it, who added their own innovations while crediting those who came before, who understood that knowledge was not possession to be hoarded, but commons to be expanded and shared and protected for those who would come after. The warmth beneath the cabin hummed its agreement with physics that needed no persuasion, and Cordelia Thorne slept, knowing that some battles once won stayed won, because they changed not just circumstances, but understanding, not just individual outcomes, but the principles that governed how communities valued knowledge and who they trusted to possess it.